Terrific group of journalists. Now to the program. David Maraniss is many things. Associate editor of the Washington Post, where he won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting on the 1992 Clinton election, and the author of 11 wonderful books. He is a deeply respected national figure. But to the Cap Times, he and wife Linda are dear friends. They are Madison West High grads and who still spend part of their year here. David jokes that he grew up on the Cap Times and grew old at the Washington Post. His father, Elliot, was at the Capital Times for 20 years and finished as our top editor, a journalist known for passion and idealism. David's upcoming 12th book is connected to his dad and McCarthyism and will be published next spring. Its title, A Good American Family, The Red Scare and My Father. David helped organize tonight's panel, and for that and his enduring friendship, we are deeply grateful. Barbara Lawton was the first woman elected lieutenant governor of Wisconsin. In that role, she launched Wisconsin Women Equals Prosperity as an initiative and emerged as a statewide and national leader on issues of climate change, clean energy, stem cell research, and affordable higher education. She chaired the National Lieutenant Governors Association and counseled national leaders on issues of gender equity and women's empowerment. Those issues have remained central to Barbara, as has her career-long focus on the corrosive effect of money in politics. We are thrilled to have Barbara joining us. Those of you of a certain age will recognize the name of David Broder, the late Washington Post reporter who for decades was revered as best capturing the real pulse of American politics. Dan Balz, who joins us tonight, has been described as the Broder of this era for his tireless and immersive reporting on the American political landscape. Dan, whose title is chief correspondent for the Post, grew up about an hour south of here in Freeport, Illinois, and has written extensively about the Midwest. He, too, is an author and regularly appears on the PBS NewsHour and on Sunday news shows such as Meet the Press. We're thrilled that Dan is here. David Axelrod is a household name for anyone who follows politics, not only because of his central strategic role in the two elections of Barack Obama, but as an insightful voice on the national scene as senior political director on CNN. He currently serves as director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. His X-Files podcasts are a must-listen for anyone seeking thoughtful, textured conversations with figures from across the ideological spectrum. He also wrote a New York Times bestseller titled Believer about his 40 years in politics. We are ecstatic to welcome David to our stage. So please join me in warmly welcoming tonight's panel to the stage of Cap Times Idea Fest. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've never been on this side of the stage before. It's wonderful that you can't see anybody.
I just want to say before you start, I'm invited to Madison by David Maraniss to this august occasion, but I figure it's Madison, we're going to be on the campus, and I show up dressed accordingly. And I think it's the first time I've seen you in a tie.
No.
I'm very self-conscious.
I have a great answer for that, which is that my wife is here. And your wife isn't.
Yes, so let's not tell her about this.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm here because the Capital Times is in my blood, and it's a way for me through this Idea Fest to honor my father, Elliot Maraniss, and the progressive traditions that the Capital Times represents, and to honor Madison, which in many ways saved my family, and so my whole family wants to honor the city and the Capital Times in that way. As the editor of the Capital Times, my father was instrumental in sort of breaking through the barriers of traditional journalism and promoting women out of the society pages and giving them substantial roles in covering the state and the city. And he always understood that change did not come without a push. And so in that spirit, I'm glad that some people pushed us even here tonight. It's essential for change. And so we'll move onward from there. I had the pleasure of being on a panel with Barbara a few months ago here in the Union for the 60s reunion. And it was the highlight of the weekend for me to listen to Barbara and to be with her for that period. And so I'm delighted that she's here again tonight. Dan Balz and I have worked together for 40 years.
40 years, right.
I came in 77 to the Post, and he came in 78. And I have to say that there are different little thrills to being a journalist. And for me, one of the great moments of joy always comes every 4 years when I sit next to Dan and we're both pounding out stories at the political conventions. It always just feels so good to be part of that with Dan. Ax and I have very similar backgrounds, both related to New York and to our fathers and to the McCarthy era to some extent. And we also have very different but deep relationships with Barack Obama. I know the Barack Obama from before he ever got into politics, and no one knows the Barack Obama after he got into politics better than David Axelrod. So it's a delight for me to be with you three. Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Great to be here.
At the beginning of this week, Dan Balz wrote for the Washington Post, "Turmoil has been the state of things from the day President Trump was sworn into office, but rarely has the chaos felt as acute as on the opening day of what could be a fateful week." I doubt even Dan realized how deeply emotional and defining this week would be. What happened in the past 36 hours has to be on everyone's mind, embedded in our communal hippocampus, a bit of science that Dr. Ford has taught us all. And I thought the best way to start tonight was with Barbara and sort of getting a sense of what this 36 hours has been like for you, where you were when you watched Dr. Ford, what emotions were running through you. Sort of every woman must have felt pretty much the same way, but I want you to sort of describe that.
Thank you. It was a really hard time. I chose to watch this alone because I didn't want to hear anyone else's voices or have it interrupted, and I wanted to take it in its fullness. And once we got past Senator Grassley's very defensive opening, and I thought, oh God, one more defensive male that we have to listen to. The women in the room know what I'm talking about. Then when Dr. Ford started her testimony, it was like a bump stock trigger that just released unbelievable emotion, anger, fear, issues coming forward, and tremendous heartbreak. I mean, I listened to it at times just in tears, not just for her, but for the children and the women across the globe that have suffered sexual violence. And I don't know a single woman who hasn't suffered unwanted sexual advances or sexual violence at some level. And so it has been a factor that has defined our lives in so many ways. And by the way, when I'll get to that in a minute. So that, for me, listening to her testimony, I also wanted to be sure that people like my daughter, who has suffered sexual violence, would get a chance to listen to it in its entirety because it was instructive. She was not only candid and clear, but she, with her scientific background, was instructive for how to think about and deal and what the process is for someone. And it will be of enduring great value for people for forever. And then it started with Kavanaugh's testimony. And he alternately kind of bellowed and bawled, and it was extraordinary. And as soon as he stopped that opening statement that revealed his entire his sense of this being a political assault instead of having understood what had just been brought out in the testimony of Dr. Ford before. So he finishes his bellowing and bawling, and all of the Republican men kind of pile on. They've set that woman aside who was meant to question, and they all literally pile on. And it felt like exactly what Dr. Ford had felt when there were two men on top of her in that room. And what we heard was, what we heard and saw demonstrated was that this man has no potential for judicial independence, and he does not have a temperament to sit on our highest court. And as my heart was broken for those children and women, as someone who has such tremendous respect for the institutions of our democracy, my heart was broken for what is happening to our country and wondering how we're going to find our way out of this. And even as all of those senators consider their vote, even this is an important part of it, but we're being distracted from other reasons why this man should not sit on our court, and there are myriad reasons.
Dan, you were in Washington when all of this was breaking. And as a journalist, you write the first draft of history. What do you think will be remembered from this week, and how defining was it in terms of where this nation is?
Well, it was very defining of where we are at this moment, which is a deeply, deeply divided country. You know, the word tribal has become a cliche, and yet it's real. And I think there are two things about yesterday that will be lasting. One is her testimony, which, as Barbara said, had an amazingly compelling quality to it because it was genuine. It was powerful. You know, I wrote today that Washington is a town of, you know, prepared sound bites and focus grouped language and all of that, and that what she offered was quite the opposite, which is just to show in a totally authentic way the power of simple language. And I think that morning session that ended at whatever it was, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I think there was almost nobody who watched that testimony who did not find her credible. And so I think that will last. I think the other thing that was so revealing is what happened in the afternoon, which was after that moment, we went back into tribal warfare. Not only is the process for picking and confirming Supreme Court justices clearly broken at this point, but there seems to be no way out of that. And I think it speaks to the broader breakdown of democracy, which Barbara alluded to. You know, this didn't happen because of Donald Trump. We were moving in that direction well before Trump got elected, but there's no question that it has deepened and it has intensified. And the country now is at such loggerheads that it would take remarkable leadership to bring us out of that, and I'm not sure that there is somebody who can do that at this point.
Well, I think that we were moving in that direction before. You're quite right, and Justice Garland can attest to that. But the thing that's different is that we now have a president and a party that's following him that is all too willing to exploit those divisions in ways that go beyond what we were accustomed to. I think what happened yesterday was the testimony of Dr. Ford was just as described. It was just powerful, ingenuous, credible, and I think that the White House and the team Kavanaugh and the leader and so on saw that, and I think that they went to Plan B, which is we're going to go totally tribal here, and we can't go after her, so we're going to make this all about the process and the Democrats, and we're going to make it impossible, we're going to make it disloyal for Republicans not to support this nominee, because not to support this nominee would be to affirm what these slimy Democrats have done. And Lindsey Graham took the point on that with his theatricality. And you know, it looked, and it still may be true, that they were successful in that. But for a chance encounter at an elevator in the Senate today, we might well be on the eve of a series of votes that would seat Kavanaugh. Those are at least going to be attenuated now while the FBI looks at this.
Let's talk about that chance encounter. He's talking about, for those of you, probably everybody in this room knows about it, but it was Senator Flake getting on the elevator in the Capitol, and a few women, before he closed the door, started telling their stories of what has happened to them. And what I'm interested in is whether that was an example of democracy in action.
Yeah.
And what that says, whether it's any redemption today because of that.
Yeah, well, I think it does speak to, it speaks to one of the great virtues of democracy, because there was a powerful person who was confronted by a citizen who had her own story to tell, and who was, but I mean, I'm not sure how it would have worked out if the world hadn't seen it. It was live on television, and Flake's discomfort was manifest. I mean, I think he was genuinely impacted by her story, but there is something about that that is really, really inspiring. That I don't know the woman's name. I think it's probably well known by now, but she played a heroic and historic role here. Just an average citizen confronting someone in power who had the ability to at least lay down in front of the train track and slow it down.
Well, and I think there were two women.
Yeah, there were two of them.
There were two women,
yeah,
actually, who asserted and reasserted, hear my voice, and here we deserve to be heard, and if you carry on and just vote through, we will know that we've just done a play acting, that you didn't hear us.
Right. And I think that's exactly what was intended.
Right.
There was a box-checking character to what was done yesterday. The notion, I mean, the fact that they had scheduled the vote in advance of the hearing tells you everything you need to know, which is, okay, we'll hear her, we'll hear her out, and then we'll vote. Yeah.
And she insisted that he look her in the eye.
Yes.
One of the things that I find interesting is that this was a very high-profile example, but it's hardly the only example of what we have seen over the last, 20 months, which is women in particular who were never particularly active politically. They may have voted with some regularity, but they had not fully engaged in the political process. And something happened. We know what happened. I mean, when Trump was elected, it was such a searing moment. I've been doing some reporting in a couple of places with talking to suburban women, and the stories that you hear about people who say, I was not active, I am now active, I am doing things that I have never done. Some are running for office, a lot of them are canvassing, they're protesting outside of congressional offices, they're doing all kinds of things. I mean, what we saw today was, in a sense, one of the most forceful examples of it, but there are tens of thousands of those examples all over the country.
But there are some women I'm wondering how they will, if they will move and change. When Donald Trump referred to women were with me, he was referring to the 52% or something of white women, right? And the 2 days after the election, his election, I was in a meeting with a man who is a leader in the Republican Party in this state, who wanted to explain, as we were all still sort of awestruck by this event in our lives. He said, you need to understand, my wife and many of the women, and this was up in north central Wisconsin, have been actively campaigning for Trump. They called themselves a posse. They were in their mid-40s to mid-50s, so this is a group. And I said, what motivated them? And he said, because they are concerned about the emasculation of young men today. No, this is serious. And he said, I have heard it from other Republican, white, we can presume, women. So I'm really anxious to see if the violence, in some sense, of the Trump administration that is felt by women accrues and affects those women.
Well, I mean, I've had conversations with women who voted for Trump and are strong supporters of Trump. And one sent me an email after I wrote something about the gender gap. And there's no question that the gender gap is bigger than it's ever been.
Yeah.
It's, you know, but she said, in essence, Barack Obama is the kind of person that you would want for a husband, a father, a brother, etc. A wonderful person. I disagreed with the way he was moving the country. And then she wrote, there's almost nothing about Donald Trump personally that is admirable. But whether it's her position on Supreme Court justices or tax cuts or a conservative agenda, her view was that I can put aside those aspects of Trump's personal behavior because I think he's moving the country. Yeah. Those women are still with him at this point.
Yeah. Relative to the hearing, Barbara, you described your reaction, and I think you got a great deal of affirmation in this room about not just how you reacted to her, but how you reacted to him. But I'm eager to see, and I'm sure there'll be some research soon, pretty quickly about how generally this was received, because my sense was by tribalizing the event, the Republicans hope to, and I think they may have succeeded to some degree in turning this into kind of this kind of Rorschach test that we've seen, so often in the Trump years, where people just see things much differently. I don't think many people will discredit her, but you hear a lot. But I've heard speaking to me. Well, they both were compelling. They both believe what they believe. I mean, someone is not telling the truth. But so I just, we are so polarized that we view events through an entirely different lens. Even something like the hearing yesterday, I'll be eager to see how it. But I just want to make one other point, because on this issue of the confrontation at the elevator, your point, Dan, I do think, I tend to the optimistic side.
You're the believer.
Yes, I'm a believer. Hard as that can be at times these days, but I think one of the things that gives me hope, I was there at the inauguration for CNN, and I went out on the streets the day after at the marches. Some of you may have been there. I was struck. I expected a great deal of anger, and what I saw was determination and a yearning for community, and I asked myself and I asked them, well, will this translate into political action, candidacies, activism and so on? The answer we've seen so far has been yes. Yeah. And so to the extent that Trump's election has spurred this new sense of activism and engagement, that's a positive thing, and we'll know in 40-something days what it produces. But I think it's real.
To close that out, I started with quoting Dan Balz, and Dan is sort of my idea of the rational mind at work. And so
little out of date on you.
And there's another writer at the Washington Post who whatever she writes, I read, just like when Dan writes, and that's Alexandra Petri, who who grew up in the prep schools of Washington, but many of you might know has a Wisconsin roots. She's the daughter of the former Congressman Thomas Petri. And she probably has the most brilliant, creative, satirical voice in America today, I would say. And usually, I mean, sometimes I'm reading her and I'm laughing out loud at the computer when I'm reading her. But she wrote something today that didn't make me laugh, but made my heart pound louder. And I wished that Alexandra could have been here tonight, but she's not, so excuse me for reading a little bit of her. She said, "Women are used to squinting to see our own stories in the stories of others, to reading ourselves into the words, all men are created equal, to being the thing tied to the tracks to raise the stakes." She was talking then about Dr. Ford describing seeing a train coming at her. "I am so tired of the moment when you discover how little your weight counts against the train's weight. I want us to be the train and not the thing thrown under it. I want us to be the thing too urgent to be stopped, not the thing that must curl up apologetically to make room for it. I'm so tired of watching us jump. I'm so tired of watching the trains keep going." And I think that there's a lot of that feeling that is being expressed in this coming election.
Yeah.
Which sort of leads us to the next short-term response to everything that's going on, which are the midterms. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of factors at play here. I'm curious what each of you think is going to happen in this midterm election. Almost every time this happens, people say it's the most important election in recent memory. It's usually total BS. It's the politicians who are saying that. It's hyperbole, but I think I've joined the hyperbolic this time and think this perhaps is the most important midterm we've faced in a long time. What do you think?
Want me to start with
Yes.
that? I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think the stakes of this midterm election are enormous. You know, if the Democrats are able to win the House, and in a sense, you would almost have to say if they can't win the House in this environment, then there's going to be a lot of hand-wringing on November 7th.
Hand-wringing, I think, would be mild.
Well,
I think that it's going to be...
I'm trying to be the rational.
Yeah, I know. Let me speak as an emotional person.
Yeah.
It's going to be devastating.
Yeah. But if that happens, the next 2 years of the Trump presidency are fundamentally different than the first two years of the presidency. Democrats will do everything they can, as they've tried to do without power, to stop him. There will be investigations, there will be subpoenas, there will be a roadblock on anything that the Republicans want to try to do. But it will also start the clock running immediately on the 2020 election. And I think that the focus will be on, within the House of Representatives, the question of whether there will be impeachment proceedings or not, and that's a serious debate that Democrats will go through, and there's not a consensus on that. And outside, it will be a search for who is capable of taking on Donald Trump to lead the Democratic Party in 2020. And then there will be the question of how President Trump reacts to being boxed in a way he hasn't been.
With equanimity, I'm sure.
Yes. And the elephant in the room, which is the Mueller investigation, which at some point he will deliver a report, which will be greeted, you know, in a highly partisan environment, and yet it is likely to have real force.
Barbara, what effect did the last year of women have on you back more than 20 years ago? And do you see that coming again? Do
you mean the year of the woman? And,
yes.
I do, actually. Of course, we've seen numbers, and I wish I had the numbers on the tip of my tongue, of how many women are running for office this year, but also organizing in different ways. And I think of, because of how gerrymandering has made so many seats simply not competitive, when I think about it from the state of Wisconsin, there's not a lot to think about. we have some interesting races, but a lot of them are set. But if I think about the midterms being supported from local and statewide races, we have a really exciting, I think, have exciting things on the horizon here. And a lot of it is being fed by women who are fed up and young people who are tired of the gridlock and step aside and let us come in and show you how to do it, and tired of the Democrats' difficulty in finding a message and a way to really speak to their constituents. And that's why my hope for congressional races actually starts with the activity and the organizing that is done very locally and for local offices, and then is bubbling up right to the top now on our statewide ticket, that there are people who have a lot more courage than an organized Democratic Party has, and I think will resonate. Very important.
I've not heard of an organized Democratic Party, but
You're right.
I'm glad to hear that there is one.
It's that circular navy shooting at each other, that one.
Yeah. But it does raise this issue because we tend to generalize from whatever the last big event was, and there's been the emergence of some very exciting progressive candidates like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in New York, and Gillum in Florida, and in Georgia, and Stacey Abrams, and in Cambridge recently. But it's also true that we're a big, diverse country, and the races that they ran wouldn't necessarily have elected Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, or Jones in Alabama, and the challenge, I think, is to find some universal themes that Democrats broadly can embrace and run on. And I think that around issues of health care and what to do about income inequality and these fundamental changes in our economy, and so there are things that Democrats broadly share. They may differ in how to approach them, or what methods to embrace. But I think this notion that Democrats are a badly divided party, that I don't feel that way.
I don't feel that they're divided. I think they are floundering, or have floundered, for a message. And one of the important parts of this election is that there is a potential for the biggest block of voters to be millennials, more than baby boomers, my generation.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because the young people are always sort of the wild card of elections for Democrats. You've been dealing this forever.
No better group than us to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, Barbara, you work on a millennial project.
I'm on
Dan and David both deal with young people all the time at Chicago and Harvard. Is this year going to be different? Do you see a change?
Well, I'll tell you what, I was with, yesterday was the beginning. We're on a quarter system, so we began our, the freshmen came in this week, and it was orientation week, and we had what we call Politipalooza at the Institute of Politics. And I did a little session with Governor Bullock from Montana, and we, as part of this, and it was outdoors behind the Institute of Politics. 600 kids showed up, and we're very much pushing voter registration and mobilization, and the interest was just extraordinary. And so we'll see. I mean, Harvard does these millennial polls. I think there are indications in these polls that there's greater interest this year. You're probably more fluent in them than I am.
Well, I think there is the potential for that, but we've kind of sensed that in the past, and often it doesn't really come to pass. And I think that it's hard to know whether you will get the youngest contingent to take that extra step, which is to actually go and vote. I mean, the efforts to register are paying some dividends. I've been out in Colorado off and on over the last several months. They vote by mail in that state. Here's a problem for young voters. They're not used to sending letters.
They don't know where stamps
No, I mean, this
right.
is, it sounds kind of hilarious.
No, you're right.
This is a serious problem.
My executive director said to me yesterday, we just had a big breakthrough. We were authorized to buy stamps.
Right.
Because the kids keep coming and saying, well, where do I get stamps?
But
Right.
there's
What
another.
is a stamp?
This is the University of Chicago, by the way.
It's not the University of Wisconsin.
There's another challenge to this, too, is that the candidates need to actually speak to them. And I have had young people who call and say, well, we were going to work for this candidate, just got together with that candidate and gave us the talking points, and they had nothing to do with our lives, our interests, or even the event that we were there. And this is when candidates can't get enough off message to speak to the day and speak to their audience. If we speak to, it's as if they need an invitation in to be empowered to take part in this.
Can I pick up on that point? Because I think it's right at the core of the issue of the future of the Democratic Party.
Right.
I tend to agree that the Democrats are not as badly divided ideologically as is sometimes suggested. There are differences. There's clearly some people who say Medicare for all and others who say, well, let's do universal care and figure out how to get as far as we can. But I think that there are some very important divisions that the Democrats have got to work out. One is the generational question.
Right.
I mean, you have this bottleneck of people who are actually
70
older
to
than
80.
we are,
Yes,
Right.
we've got a
which
bunch
means
of...
quite old, who are in a sense suppressing a younger generation from rising up to take over the
Right.
party. I think the other point that you made, which is that there is an enormous amount of progressive action at the grassroots among people who don't particularly identify with the Democratic
Right.
Party. They may agree with Democrats on a number of the issues, but they don't feel a part of that. And the third piece of that is the rising significance of women, and particularly college-educated women, within the Democratic coalition. Anna Greenberg is a Democratic pollster, and I talked to her about this a month or so ago, and she said, I don't think we're so much a party divided, but we are a party in flux. And the Democrats are going to have to figure out how to take in a different group of people and not just get their votes, but give them power.
There's an interesting phenomenon that just happened up in Door County, where for the spring elections, a group of young millennial women started to organize, recruit candidates, and really engage the community in a nonpartisan fashion over some really important issues that define their lives up there. So they were really building community around issues, elected a progressive majority to the city council in Sturgeon Bay, and then there was a special election called for the state senate seat up there that had been held by a Republican since the 70s. And they took all of that and a sense of community around issues and could turn it behind him, even people who hadn't necessarily thought of themselves as Democrats, and won big, and overperformed for that area in a huge way. And now they're working toward the next spring election, building community now that is going to be reflected in the fall election.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of that going on around the country. My observation of young people is that they hunger for an authentic politics,
Yes.
a politics of meaning. The old cliches really ring hollow. And if you look at the candidates who have been really successful in capturing the imagination of young people, it's like Beto O'Rourke in Texas, who's running a very organic campaign. And Abrams and Gillum and Ocasio-Cortez and candidates like that who seem real and seem connected with their communities and seem to want to do big things and not simply incremental things. And so I think that that is a clash. I mean, a clash of styles. And I think one of the failures in 2016 was to communicate that kind of authentic message to young people who, frankly, didn't vote.
In this case, I'm a believer too.
All right.
I teach at Vanderbilt every other year, and the last few classes I've had, I've seen a commitment toward politics on the part of the students that I hadn't seen before. And I really I'm a believer in this generation to make change, and I think that it goes down to the high school level, and what the Parkland students did was an enormous burst of energy for the whole country. And so I'm curious whether, this is just a technical question, but are the polls sophisticated enough to pick up on whether these students are going to vote through, because you can't pull them through landlines?
No, well, no, but I mean, there's a lot of, we do, landlines and cell phones. I mean, the bigger problem is just the degree to which the entire polling industry is
and
troubled.
They don't answer the phone anymore. They text.
Yeah.
Yes.
So can you poll by text?
Hard to do.
There are online polling.
Poll on Snapchat.
That's right.
But it
is hard to know.
That's it.
To echo your point, though, I go home inspired every day and hopeful every day because of these young people who, the challenge is they want to change the world. They want to make a difference. It is our job, and it's not always an easy job, to persuade them that politics is necessarily the way to do it. They'll say, well, let's start an app, let's create, let's do something on social media, which is very, very powerful, but, Congress is going to meet with them or without them, and state legislatures and city councils and so on, and they're going to make decisions that very much affect the equities. And so I'm having these conversations all the time, but it's an easier conversation to have now. I don't hear nearly as much, that elections don't really matter.
Right.
No, but it's also not such a savory thing to contemplate running for office anymore as well. The level of personal
I don't know, Barbara, I've never run. I'll have to take your word for it.
I know. And it's a very different thing to put your own neck
I
out
know.
instead of someone else's, right?
Understood. Wow.
But the other thing is
Don't think I didn't know that.
The other thing, though, is that there are too many people in my generation who don't want to step aside, who don't want to make space. We need to have younger people with a high look, Speaking of trains, for me, the future comes at me like a steaming train. But for them, they have a high-arcing view of the future, and that perspective really needs to be reflected in decision-making at the highest levels.
Well, David, you started your wonderful Axe Files exactly 3 years ago tonight with an interview with Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
And among the things he was able to do was
Speaking of the youthful future of the Democratic Party.
Well, there's the paradox,
Yeah.
Yes.
right? He was the oldest, if he runs again, he'll be the oldest candidate, and yet he did inspire kids to a degree that the other candidates did not. But maybe this time it's time for him to step aside for some of the younger.
Maybe so. I'll address that in a second. But I do remember at the end of that podcast, I said to him, I've got 2,000 kids waiting to hear from you. We did this podcast in an RV from the airport to the University of Chicago. We picked him up, and I said, "You're kind of an unlikely rock star," and he said, "Just don't talk to me about those selfies. I can't stand those selfies." But
I think he learned to like them.
I think he captured
much.
the imagination of young people in part because he is authentic. Bernie Sanders has been saying the same thing for 50 years. And he believes in those things, and those things have currency. Some of those things have currency, and I think he also benefited from, he was running against Hillary Clinton, who many young people viewed as an establishment candidate and part of the status quo, and he took advantage of that. I don't know that he can replicate that again. And now there are other people who are competing for that base in different ways. Elizabeth Warren, it seems to me, is likely to run.
Speaking of the youth of the party.
Yeah. Well, she's younger than Bernie. But no, but I mean, but there are younger,
younger than Biden, younger than
yeah,
Yes.
than Mike Bloomberg. But she,
quite a future the Democrats have.
yes, we're awash in octogenarians. There are other candidates, you know, who also I think will have a claim to that. You know, the Cory Bookers and the
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, and you know. So I think it's going to be very interesting. I think it's not obvious to me how this is going to unfold.
Yeah. You know, I think there's another thing about why Bernie Sanders connected. I mean, I agree completely with what you said about that sort of authenticity and that he believes in it. But also, he was talking about big things.
Yes.
This was, and you know, some people dismissed it as unrealistic, and yet, you know, people want to believe that big things should and can be done in this country. And you know, in a sense, it's left to others to try to figure out how to make that happen in the end. But somebody has to inspire people to want to do it, and I think that was part of the reason he was successful.
And those young people know that if you don't have a vision, you'll never get there. And the incremental politics that people think are essential to getting elected and staying in office have done nothing for this country, really.
I'm going to close out the millennial old age versus young people section with my belief in the banana, which is my wife came home the other day and said, I was walking down, well, probably Becky Blank knows this too. She said, I was walking through the campus and a banana came up to me. And it was a kid who's out there registering voters. And
As a banana?
As a banana. So the bananas are going to vote.
Okay. Sounds very appealing. So.
Oh.
See, that is not a joke that younger people would appreciate. That is a dad joke.
We forget that Axelrod started out as a writer.
So let's move on to the other party. Barbara and David are Democrats. Dan and I are journalists. We all are interested in, and you know, for the last year or so, I've been citing the obvious, which is that Trump is Trump, but who's responsible for what Trump is doing? And it's the Republican establishment for letting it happen. And so, you know, I'm curious, first of all, David, about sort of the, you know, it seems like a year ago, but a couple of weeks ago, everybody wanted to know who Anonymous was. And you know, the whole notion of somebody working inside the White House or inside the Trump administration, sort of writing about how they're trying to protect him, what do you think about that? And is that the right way to approach it, or why aren't Republicans approaching it directly?
Well, first of all, let me say the whole thing, having worked in the White House, is unthinkable. I mean, it is the notion that you'd have people kind of plotting to save the president from himself and stealing stuff off his desk. Well, I guess, you know, it's just, it speaks to the uniqueness of the situation that we're in. And I don't know. I mean, you know, I was asked about this, and I said only half jokingly that it would be like Murder on the Orient Express trying to find Anonymous, and it may be that there were like a dozen people.
Does everybody get that? Okay.
It may be that there were like a dozen people each writing one line of that. You know, because apparently it takes a village to protect the president from himself. But it is an appalling state when you have people conspiring. Now, I will say, I have no idea. I was offended in certain ways that someone would write the piece, because you should either declare yourself and leave. And what is the purpose of writing a piece and saying we're there, to keep him from going nuts, when you know the piece itself is going to drive him nuts? I mean, and to me it was sort of self-serving and maybe a way of explaining to people, why those who stay so that they can still travel in polite company.
Dan, you must deal with various anonymouses or people in the administration every day or every week who express various levels of frustration over him. Why do you think it's persisting?
Well, I think there is, on the part of a lot of people who go into government, a combination of sort of motivations. One is a dedication to the country and a desire to serve the country. And I think that that's a genuine feeling that people have. And I think that there are a lot of Republicans who have had to think very long and hard about whether they wanted to work for this administration. And many have chosen not to, but some have chosen to do so for what I think they believe are the best of reasons, which is that, good people need to serve. There is one president, but it's a big government, and you need those people. There's certainly a personal motivation on the part of people who are at a certain level or a certain point in their career where they know that the value of having served in a responsible position in a presidential administration,
even in an irresponsible administration,
even in an irresponsible administration, that there is personal value in that. I think that what Mr. or Ms. Anonymous was saying is also part of it, which is there are aspects about this president that we feel the need to contain him, and yet there are other things that are being done as a result of him being in office that they believe in. But I think it is a terribly conflicting time. And I think that you have to know that there are a lot of people within the government who see the president in the same way that people outside of the government see him, as volatile, as often irresponsible, as somebody who flies off the handle, and yet they are kind of working through that. So I have no idea who this person was who wrote it. I only hope that it was, in fact, truly a very senior administration official. Otherwise, I don't think there was a justification in publishing it. But
do you think the Washington Post would have published it? I've said no.
I think we probably would not have. That's my guess. Yeah. So.
And Barbara, did you ever write such a letter to the Capital Times when Jim Doyle was governor?
No.
Just kidding, everybody.
No, but when I think about it, I don't see any signs of real. All we see is chaos coming out of the White House, and no real competence in important ways. And so I think really serving this administration is just going to be a sign of your incompetence and willingness to compromise your integrity at that level. I mean, it's so bungled. Everything.
I guess it does give me, the fact that Mattis is over there, we had differences, the Obama administration had differences with him, but it strikes me that he is a responsible person.
Right.
Having someone in that position, given the proclivities of this president, that seems pretty important. I can't imagine that he's having a great time.
No.
I think he's hanging around for the laughs.
Yeah.
I think he's staying there because he thinks he has a responsibility to the country. I'm not going to denigrate that.
No, I didn't mean cabinet members per se, although we could put some in that category. I was looking at the support that should have things support the president's action or anything coming out of the White House has not been competent.
Yeah. I don't think any of us have a complete I mean, there are a lot of books being written. I'm not sure anybody can actually capture the experience of what it must be like to work with this guy on a daily basis in that White House.
It's a constant series of surprises for people who work very closely in the White House. Now, I mean, I'm not on the front line of our coverage of the White House. Our White House team is. And they have been reporting from day one of the shock and the surprise and you know, this
scrambling,
yeah. You know, people waking up and seeing a tweet, you know, Secretary of State being dismissed by a tweet, a change in Pentagon procedure having to do with transgender by tweet. None of this prepared, none of this, you know, nobody was warned about this. I mean, it's an enormously difficult thing to live under those circumstances. And there are throughout the government still a lot of very good people who are working in that environment. But the president is the president. And everybody has presumably a level of patience or not that will keep them there only so long. And then, as we've seen, there's been tremendous turnover in this administration.
And I expect that after this midterm, there will be a real emptying out.
I agree.
Every White House leaks. Yours did, although not as much. I mean, no White House that Dan or I have ever encountered leaks as much as this one. Would you agree? I mean, it's just like,
oh yeah,
Ashley and Costa and everybody get 14 sources on their stories.
Well, but you need 14. But you need 14 sources because
no one's on the record.
You can't get 3 people to agree on what the story is, right? You know, there are disciplined White Houses or disciplined organizations that we've all covered, and you can, you know, with a relatively few number of telephone calls, you can get the story of what happened, you know, at a particular moment. But with this, and I think even more so in the first year of the administration, I think it's, you know, you may not believe this, but I think it's settled down a little bit in some ways. But there was so much infighting and so much backbiting that when our people would call somebody to try to find out what happened, it was not just getting the story of what happened. Somebody wanted to take a shot at somebody else.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that was part of the reality of it. These fiercely opposed camps around the president, all fighting in one way or another to become the supreme in the White House.
That is not those kinds of rivalries within a White House are not uncommon. I mean, not to that degree, because usually there's pretty much cohesion within an administration. I mean, but the thing that makes the leaks out of this White House unusual is so many of them are about the president himself. They're not one person trying to take another person out. So many of them are about his own behavior, his own, you know, erratic nature and so on. And that is what I find astonishing, is just how freely people are willing to talk about, you know, what a freak show it is.
I want to turn to another major subject. You know, I'd say there are 3 enormous social movements that have changed America over the last 50 years. One is women's rights, another is gay rights, and the third is civil rights. And I've always believed that race is the American dilemma and has been from the beginning and still is. And I know, Dan, that you wrote recently about a very interesting political science report about the 2016 election, which argued that it wasn't so much the economics as the cultural identification, which to a large degree means race. Can you talk about that, and then we can all discuss?
Yeah, this is a book that's coming out in a couple of weeks by 3 political scientists: John Sides, who's at George Washington University, Lynn Vavreck, who's at UCLA, and Michael Tesler, who is at UC, I believe it's Irvine. And John and Lynn did a book on the 2012 campaign, which was a political scientist's attempt to parse through the kinds of things that Axe has done as a strategist and that I've done as a reporter on campaigns, and to go to fundamentals. And what they did in this new book, the piece I wrote was about a chapter that was said, the title was What Happened? And what they concluded was that when you cut through everything that was going on and all of the descriptions of why Trump ultimately got elected, and there are obviously 1,000 reasons, but what they concluded was that it was identity issues, and particularly racial issues and racial attitudes, that had the biggest impact on the Trump coalition. Not that every Trump voter or even a high percentage are outright racist, but that attitudes about race trumped attitudes about economic anxiety. And what they said was that they came up with a phrase of racialized economics as opposed to economic anxiety being a driving factor in what separated people who voted for Trump as opposed to those who didn't. It's a very, I mean, it's a scholarly work. It's not popular writing, but it's a very powerful analysis of what happened.
There's an interesting essay that came out a year or so ago titled On Being Midwestern, The Burden of Normality. I think I shared it with you.
Yes.
And it's a really important look at taking a look at Midwestern states and how we were America's foundry and its breadbasket, and in times of war, its armory. We were settled by immigrants who grew things and made things as farmers and entrepreneurs. We laid out our state in a grid so you weren't more than 2 miles away from your school or, as he put it, a tank of gas from a college, and really that's the way it was. And there was a sense of this is the American story, and this is normal. And in that sense, it's white, right? And so there's the change or challenge of changing populations to that. There's been a tremendous resistance, even as that would betray the movement following abolition. They ignore that. This is still what Midwestern is. And there's inherent in that the violence of settling what was already settled. We have 11 Native American tribes here. But it's still this deep-rooted sense that this is the way it should be, and we don't want to be challenged.
But you're absolutely right. Race has coursed through our politics from the beginning, the original sin, and we've never recovered from it. But I think it's important to note that we're not the only democracy that's going through these wrenching things. And you look at Europe, for example, and you look at the Brexit vote and the leave vote on Brexit. I know Dan's done reporting over there. And you overlay it on the Trump vote here, and there are a lot of similarities. And of course, the migration issue there is part of the animating force, but so are the economic issues. I mean, there is a sense of agreement about what has been lost place, but also economic loss. And I think they're intermingled, the cultural and the economic. And so maybe that's a good way to put it, as they termed it. But I wouldn't be dismissive. I mean, I spoke earlier, and you were there. I think we live in revolutionary times, and technology and globalization and the migrations of people have created enormous change, and I think it's coming faster than we can get our arms around. The way we communicate exacerbates these tensions. These are great challenges for all democracies and our democracy.
I have to apologize. In my addled brain, I forgot to announce at the beginning that they were passing out some note cards for people to write questions if they had any. Did that happen, Chris? And anyway, if it did, we'll take a few of those at the end. So I'm sorry I didn't announce that earlier. Another major issue that all three of you have either dealt with or written about is dark money. I know, Barbara, it's probably the issue at the core of what you've dealt with. And of course, David has been dealing with money forever, and Dan's been writing about it. And you know,
see no evil, hear no evil, speak
I'm
no
sort
evil.
I'm wondering where we are in that whole place. You know, I mean, because in some ways it seems that money is having less effect now, but in some ways it seems like it's down. I go back and forth on that. And I know, I mean, obviously, you know, since Citizens United, dark money has had an enormous impact. And yet you see sometimes now where people can break through that. So where are you on that? And do you think we'll ever get to the reforms that
I don't know. A major national campaign reform group just announced that they were becoming much smaller and maybe folding. But part of the reason was that there have been so many other movements and organizations around the issue of money and politics that have sprung up and that are more local. And what is, I don't know, I mean, it is something since the first time I ran for office and said, whoa, I'm never doing that again. Because it is so diminishing to your soul to beg for money. And then when you get closer to the underbelly of our system, you can see how it skews policy and how it fundamentally keeps us in incremental politics instead of the bold things that we ought to be doing. What has been interesting to me of late is that, for instance, in Wisconsin, 131, something like that, local municipalities or county organizations have had advisory referendum on the ballot that have argued to support the overturning Citizens United, which is not, you know, if you've studied this stuff, it's not the whole answer, but it was a way to poll people about how they felt. And interestingly, even in the last gubernatorial election, it was on the ballot in Brown County, Green Bay, where Scott Walker had already won election and re-election, or won a recall. So it's on his re-elect ballot. He won handily, as he had the other times, and 75% of the people voted to overturn Citizens United, as they have in Waukesha County and Walworth and all of these red places. I don't hear a single candidate speak to this issue really, not in a profound way, because they don't believe that it matters, and yet it really does. And I've counseled candidates, really, you want to get independence and pull people together? This is a very strong, people understand how serious this is, but they don't know what can be done. And there are bills before Congress. I won't work with anyone who's not going to lead on that.
You know, I spoke earlier about Beto O'Rourke.
Right, he's doing that.
He's raised an enormous amount of money, mostly in small contributions online. And one of the things about the internet is it is a democratizing force in terms of fundraising. It does, you know, I'm not in any way minimizing the impact of money in politics. It is profound, and the dark money piece of it is getting worse. But there is this other side of it. You know, what you see with Democratic candidates across the country now is that, and it's unusual, but they're better funded in many cases than their opponents, because there is this mobilization that we talked about earlier, and it's reflecting itself in campaign contributions and small donations coming online. So that is one offset that is encouraging. We also ought to point out that Donald Trump spent less than the others in his campaign. So all you have to do is become host of Celebrity Apprentice, and you can overcome these things.
I don't know of an issue that is probably more uniting in this country than the view that money in politics is a corrupting influence. Everywhere you go, every person you talk to, every survey you look at, every focus group you sit in on and listen to people, no matter where it is, no matter kind of what the particular ideological stance or political identification people have, they hate the idea of too much money in politics. Now, there's no easy way to solve that. No. Every effort at campaign finance reform creates some other avenue in which the money continues to pour in.
But the small donor match public funding that has worked well where they've been able to get it through.
But it died at the federal level.
Yes, of course.
But I mean, but I think David's right. I heard a Republican the other day talking about 2020, and he said that he believes that in 2020 the big donors, the big bundlers, are going to have much less impact than they have had in the past, for the very reason that David was talking about. That there is now a way for individuals to give money to candidates they like, and to give no matter where they are. I met a woman in the suburbs of Colorado in August, and she's a doctor, and so she said, I have some money, and she said, this time, which I've never done before, any candidate anywhere who I like, I send a small check to, and this is happening in all kinds of places. So the ability to fundraise and finance a campaign without the big money is now possible.
Which is fine for Beto O'Rourke or Alexandra, but
it's
if you're
Beto,
running,
by the way.
if you're running here for assembly, state senate, state treasurer, attorney general, or governor, it's difficult to light those fires.
But you know,
it's
I think one
happen.
of the things that I think there is a greater awareness of that, and you see organizations growing up, including the one that Holder's running with the president, that are raising money for legislative candidates, for down ballot candidates that are getting contributions and then distributing money that way. So there, you know, I mean, I don't want to, again, I mean, having spent the time that I spent in Washington and having been around politics for a very long time, it is appalling how much time people have to spend raising money and how responsive people feel they need to be to.
Well, your guy was kind of a mixed bag on that, wasn't he? I mean, in one sense, he got enormous amount of small donations. In another sense, he rejected public financing.
Yes. Yeah. And
was that a debate at all, or is that just a question of?
It was. You know, there was a fear of being overrun by independent expenditures and third-party donors, and that we had to. You know, we saw in 2004 John Kerry lived within the system and died within the system because he took such incoming during the summer of 2004 from the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth and so on. And we just didn't want to be we didn't want to be swift boated. Right. And so that was really, there wasn't that much of a discussion. We were informed by squalid history.
You know, the Trump example, as David said, is one where it's a reminder that at the presidential level, you know, money alone is no longer the coin of the realm necessarily, but in a lot of these state races, what we're seeing this year is in state legislative races, that outside money coming in places where individual candidates have trouble raising it, and the outside money can swamp it. I think it's more difficult to do that at the national level.
It's, you know, one thing on this presidential thing, just as an aside, I can't think of an ad that actually swayed a presidential election that aired after Labor Day, because the coverage of these campaigns is so intense that people basically default to what they see on you know, in all these news outlets and so on. I mean, they're watching the campaign in real time, and so these ads become less effective, but lower down on the ballot, they're more impactful.
You know, even here in Wisconsin, the money being spent against Tammy Baldwin and the television and radio ads that have been running for a long time, you know, it's dark money at its darkest, and yet it's not necessarily moving the polls against
Yeah.
her, which I find really interesting. And,
Yeah. She's
and a great comment about her.
Yeah. She has been too smart in office and served too well to be taken down that easily.
It's also true that this is a propitious time, I think, even in a red state or a purple state or to
be a
Democrat. You know, I mean, this is not going to be a welcoming time for Republicans.
It's such a paradox, isn't it? That if Hillary had won, all of these candidates would be toast, including probably Tammy. You know, it's just the way the up and down of this goes.
Yes, I've been on the wrong side of these waves. I know.
If you three don't mind, I'd like to personalize just a little bit so that this audience can know a little bit more about all three of you brilliant people. Barbara, how, you know,
Don't agree to anything.
Yeah, just about beginnings. For you, you know, what got you into politics, and what was the beginning of that inspiration?
Completely typical in terms of a woman running for office the first time. I waited to be invited. Seriously. I never had a thought of running for office. I was certain I was too outspoken to win. No, but I did. I waited to
And a
be
man
invited.
invited you, or
Yes,
yeah,
of course. And I really, there was a race in Green Bay for state senate, and they felt that the Democratic candidate who was currently running didn't have a chance, and asked, I don't know where, you know, where'd you get my name? Because I was active in the community, but I wasn't active in the party. I had no confusion about what party I belonged to. So I was asked to run that way. And then you're thrown into, that was the very first year of independent expenditures, 1996. And it was wild because as all the money in ads is shooting over your head and you're trying to establish a voice, and the people yet at that point weren't yet sophisticated enough to know whose voice was coming at them. They always assumed it was either you or your opponent, and it was a wild ride.
Did you enjoy it?
I did. In the end, I did. It was intense, as I said. It was a very close look at the underbelly of our system. And I learned an awful lot. And I was determined then to work on the issue of money in politics because you could see how it played out. But that's how it started.
Dan, were you writing for your own little journal when you were 5 years old, or how?
I started writing at a pretty young age, actually. I was not at all political as a kid. I grew up in Freeport, Illinois, and
Someone claps.
there's a pretzel somewhere in the audience.
Is it really the pretzels? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it is
like
really
the
the
Santa
pretzels.
Barbara banana slugs or something.
Well, you know, it's
Tastier, though.
There were a lot of Germans who helped settle Freeport, and apparently there was a pretzel factory, or maybe not, but at any rate, you know, it's a unique mascot name, and we love it. We took a vacation when I was 7 years old to Colorado with another family, and we camped and all of that. And I came back and wrote like a 12-page story about our vacation in Colorado. And I continued to do that kind of sort of make-believe writing. And then, but without a sense that I was going to go into journalism, and certainly not to cover politics. I went to the University of Illinois and kind of bounced around my freshman year, and I had an older brother, and he was in the Journ School, and he said to me at the end of my freshman year, if you really want to do something useful with, you know, your time here, you should join the student newspaper, the Daily Illini. And I did as a sophomore, and fell in love with covering the news and writing the news and all aspects. You know, when you're a student journalist, you get to do everything, putting out the paper. And then at the end of that year, I went to Washington as an intern in the office of my congressman, John B. Anderson, who later ran for president, sought the Republican nomination in '80, lost it, and then ran as an independent. And those experiences fused into one, which is I thought I want to be a Washington reporter. Again, not I want to cover politics for the rest of my life, but I want to be a Washington reporter. And one thing built on itself, and I got a couple of exceedingly lucky breaks along the way, and have been foolish enough to stay with it.
So it was the late, great Doug Balz who got you into it, sort of?
Doug got me into it.
There are two great Balz journalists.
Yeah, Doug went on to have a terrific journalism career. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he worked, among other places, at the Chicago Tribune and was the managing editor of the Tribune magazine for a number of years.
David's story is kind of famous.
I should signify with all these Madison people here that one of my early assignments as a political writer at the Tribune was to cover the John Anderson's running mate in 1980, who was, of course, Pat
Lucy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And David, I know your beginnings are kind of illuminated in your book, but this audience might not know it also.
They haven't read the book.
Are you giving it away tonight?
I'll be in the lobby. I had a kind of transformational event when I was 5.
We all did.
Yes. Yeah. Which was that John F. Kennedy came to the place where I grew up was Stuyvesant Town, a housing development that was built for returning war veterans in New York. And I was just transfixed by this spectacle of Kennedy jumping on. This was 12 days before the 1960 election. It was so long ago that a Democrat actually had a campaign in New York. Now they just drop by to pick up cash. He was, it was just, I was so interested in that, and I just started paying a lot of attention, and his brother Bobby ran for the Senate in New York, and I worked for him when I was 9, not as the strategist. And then, I came to Chicago.
What did you do?
I was the field director. Then I came to the University of Chicago to really because I was interested in politics, and Chicago was such a rich and interesting political town. And as I joked this morning, when I got to the University of Chicago in 1972, I couldn't find anybody who wanted to talk about anything that happened after the year 1800. So that led me into journalism, and I spent 10 years in journalism, including 8 at the Chicago Tribune, mostly as a political writer there. And then I moved over to work for Paul Simon, who was a congressman running for the U.S. Senate. Yeah, worthy of a hand. He's a great man. And that was it. That was the path.
How about you, David?
I was so bad at everything else in life. And as I said at the beginning, I was born with journalism in my blood. My grandfather was a printer on Coney Island. My mother was a book editor. My dad was a newspaper man. My 3 siblings were all geniuses, and I was the dumb kid in the family and followed my dad into journalism. But David, I think many people in this audience, including myself, were also touched by John Kennedy in 1960. He came here to the field house, which I lived a half block away from at that time. And that's an experience that many of us will not forget either, that filling the field house that late October day.
Yeah.
We're going to go to a couple of questions. The first one is what I was going to ask next anyway, although it's put slightly differently. But it's good enough to get any of us going. Who has the best chance of beating Trump in 2020?
I'd say Trump.
Well, let's put it a different way. Tell me, each of you, one person who you think is in the top tier of favorites and one person who would be your dark horse?
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, if she runs, I think Elizabeth Warren is in the top tier.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any question about that. The dark horses, I mean, there are so many possibilities on that. I don't know where to start. I mean, I think that Kamala Harris has made a mark fairly quickly in the Senate and has captured the imagination of people, and also has the advantage of a primary calendar that might play to some of her strengths, including the fact that California has moved up to an earlier primary. But the question is taking on Trump, which I think is a very big challenge. I think that it is very difficult to run against him. You can't let him take you down to his level, because nobody survives that. And it is very difficult to take him on if you are not, in a sense, engaged and combative with him. So finding that balance. And as Barbara said, to find a message that, that rises above, in a sense, the principles and values that Democrats share, that will speak not only to core Democrats, but beyond that, to a larger part of the country.
Which leads to another point. The essential quality that you need to beat Donald Trump is to be the nominee. And, we speak about this, I said this earlier, we speak about this as if it is like a national, like the Voice or one of these reality shows where people perform and then America votes, and there's a process here, and it begins in Iowa and it runs through New Hampshire and Nevada, South Carolina. You're right that Californians moved the primary, and it was to advantage Senator Harris. If she decides to run, they'll start voting, early voting, the day of the Iowa caucuses, which is something new. I suspect, though, that the winner of the Iowa caucuses will suddenly vault into the picture there. So one of the questions is, how do you navigate the primaries and still and emerge as someone who is a strong candidate against Trump? And that's going to be a challenge. Now, don't ask me who can do that, but I do think that's an issue. Every candidate who comes to me, I ask the same question, which is, what is your plan to get through the first 4 contests, because it's going to winnow down the field dramatically, and can you raise the money to compete in those contests?
Barbara?
It's always the first question. Can you raise the money? I think, I can't say one. There are 2 that I find really interesting, and one is Kamala Harris, and the other is Kirsten Gillibrand. I think she's really an interesting candidate.
I was thinking yesterday that it would, of course, never have happened, but it might have been effective if the Democrats had all let Kamala Harris do all the questioning. I've never seen a Judiciary Committee member do it.
That would be like one group of politicians to designate one in their group and say, why don't you ask all the questions?
Yeah, not going to happen.
I mean, listen, you saw how those guys chafed. They couldn't contain themselves. I mentioned you guys earlier in the middle of the questioning by that prosecutor.
Oh, yeah.
I said that they were going to have to give Lindsey Graham a seatbelt.
I said a muzzle.
Yeah, and it didn't take long for that to break down. So,
Here's a great question. I would like to hear the panel discuss some of the issues that will most strongly affect young people, like climate change, cost of education, and work-life balance. I can start by saying that even today, in the midst of all of the craziness, a story in the Washington Post, right, Dan, about climate change, where the Trump administration itself had acknowledged that the temperature will rise by 7 degrees by 2100. And of course, they used it as a rationalization to say, so who cares? Let's just pollute because it's going to happen anyway. Seriously. But let's address those issues. Climate change.
And income inequality,
and
let's
income,
add, because
okay.
I think there are structures in the way that we are creating public policy that exacerbates it, obviously, depending on what our tax policy is, et cetera. And I think that those are the issues that are going to shape the lives for young people going forward. One of the issues in the nomination of Kavanaugh is his excitement about the possibility of overturning the Chevron deference, the way by which a law can, that is somewhat ambiguous, leaves room for interpretation in the agencies so that the experts can actually enforce and move it forward, is that he wants to overturn that possibility so that the judges get to do that.
Can you talk to work-life balance?
And how are you doing with that?
Mine's been out of balance for a long time. I agree on climate change. I think the issue of college cost and student debt, which Bernie Sanders just, I mean, every time you went to a Sanders rally and he would say, well, how many people here have student debt? And, you know, huge number of the young people raised their hand. And then he would kind of go up the ladder in terms of how much. And it is astonishing how many people are saddled with enormous amounts of student debt. And it is crushing on people because the opportunities for high-paying jobs are more limited because of the nature of the economy. The ability to build up savings is more difficult because of the nature of the economy and the movement of people in and out of jobs. So I think this broader question of how the country adapts to a globalized economy in which people are more on their own than ever to take care of themselves, of their own finances, is something that particularly affects young people.
And Dan, it also affects the number of people who look at public service as a possibility, because the pay tends to be less and you can't afford it if you have a great deal of debt.
Akin to that is the issue of health care, though, you know, we still struggle. There is the invulnerability thing with young people and the notion of, but I think there is a recognition among them that we need to do something about that, and that fundamentally, you know, it is unjust to have a country in which millions and millions of people go without health care. And as an economic issue, because we are so mobile, the notion that health care is tied to your employment is a real challenge for these young people who are moving from place to place and job to job.
And I think we can't ignore the work-life balance question, being one of, only 3 countries left in the entire world that doesn't have guaranteed paid maternity leave, which is amazing. And it's us and like Swaziland, Lesotho, and Papua New Guinea or something. You know, seriously, that is it. And that is where I see that for all of the good intentions of men and greater sharing of family responsibilities, in terms of those public policy issues, they don't hit the top of the agenda unless a woman leads it.
I'm going to deal with 4 more questions. The first one is sort of parochial, but you can probably answer it in some way, and I'm sure that many people in this audience want to know the answer to this question. Where is the Democratic Party's support for Tony Evers? I don't see the DCCC working here to support Democratic candidates.
But those are 2 separate things.
Yes, they
right?
are, exactly. I'm not even sure it's true.
No, I don't think it's true. But I do think actually that the Democratic Party is thoroughly, strongly behind Tony Evers and Mandela Barnes. We have actually this year a superb statewide ticket.
Yeah. I do think there's a growing recognition, you know, that there's nothing that gets people's attention like polls. Mm-hmm. And there's a growing recognition that, wow, this could actually happen in Wisconsin. And, you know, Scott Walker's pretty well known around the country. And I don't think it's lost on Democrats what it would mean to see a change of leadership here in Wisconsin, especially given what happened in 2016. So I do think that there is incoming help, and I expect it's going to grow in the next 40 days.
And what's happening here is happening across the Midwest, potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, it is
Michigan.
It is not out of the question that
Iowa.
by the time the election is over, Democrats will hold every governorship from Kansas to Pennsylvania. If you think of the Midwest or the Plains and the Rust Belt, that whole stretch, with the exception of Indiana, all could end up in Democratic
I think this
hands.
is going to be I think women are going to be a big story on election night, and I think the transformation of the Midwest is going to be the other.
This one is just for humor, I guess. How do journalists like Dan and David resist the temptation to write gossip?
What makes you think we resist? How do we resist the...
Yeah, and instead focus on reporting critical facts.
Well, you know, we're not allowed...
You speak for both of us.
We're not allowed to write gossip at the Washington Post. No. Look, I mean, there's a lot of gossip in all journalism, or not all journalism, but there's a certain amount of gossip in journalism. But I think that we had a managing editor named Steve Call, who's now the dean at Columbia. And I remember he would often say, and I think this is just such an important reminder, he said, no matter what beat you are on, no matter what you're covering at the paper, you should constantly be asking yourself, what are the 3 or 4 big questions about the area of coverage that you have responsibility for? And how is your coverage helping to answer those questions? It's not that one story or 5 stories answer those questions, but if you're not thinking about those things, then you are often doing more trivial coverage. You get distracted. It's very hard sometimes not to get distracted. But if you keep your eye on those things, then you're more likely to be doing what good journalism should do.
For myself, since I've written mostly in the area of biography, my whole approach has been to try to understand why people are the way they are, and the forces that shape them, both sociologically, culturally, geographically. And so that's really my obsession in writing, and it's driven me throughout my career, and it really, gossip doesn't play any role in that. Let's close with probably the most important question I could ask. What reasons, this is from a young person, what reasons do I have as a recent graduate to be optimistic for the future of our politics or our country?
Yeah. Well, look, I said earlier I go home optimistic every day, so I don't want to turn it back on this young person, but the lack of cynicism, young people are skeptical, but they're not cynical. Yes. And there is a recognition that I think is very broad among the young people that I come in contact with, that we do have responsibilities larger than ourselves, and that the future isn't, as Robert Kennedy said, future is not a gift, it's an achievement. And we have to find a way to work toward that, and that gives me hope. I think that this activism that we've seen in response to Trump gives me hope. The most important tool that we have in a democracy in terms of bringing about change is activism and voter participation. So, and I think we're going to see a bunch of that come November. But let me just make one last point on this. I've also worked inside of government and inside a White House, and I told this story. I will truncate it right now. But the night the Affordable Care Act passed, we'd all worked hard on that issue, and we were in the Roosevelt Room at the White House. And when the final results came in, they were still counting on the final House vote on the Affordable Care Act, and we anticipated winning, and it was exciting. But I found myself getting up sort of involuntarily, and I walked into my office and I closed the door, and I broke down and I sobbed. And I couldn't even understand why at first, but the reason really was that I have a young child, I had a young child, I don't have any young children now, but who had a chronic illness that almost bankrupted us when she was small, and it was a real terror. And I realized that because of what we had done that night, that there would be people who wouldn't have to go through, and families who wouldn't have to go through what ours went through. And I went and I found the president, and I thanked him on behalf of those families. And he put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "That's why we do the work." Mm-hmm. And when you have the opportunity to do those things that actually touch people's lives in a way that's meaningful, that's an extraordinary thing, and it makes you realize how important this is and how you can actually make it, even in this ugly and dismal environment. There are these rays of hope and light. And the only thing, I said this earlier to these young people I was talking to, I think the greatest threat we face as a country now is cynicism. If we allow cynicism to win, this notion that we can't make a difference and that it's not worth trying, then we are really lost.
I think that's very well said. I would only add to that I think there is a resilience to this country. We're clearly in a very challenging moment, and we focus so much on the dysfunctional aspect of our national politics, and it certainly is dysfunctional right now. But there are some amazing and powerful things and important things that are happening all over the country, in the states, in cities, in private sector. And I think that a sense of the difference between the dysfunctionality and the sense of possibility that exists if people are willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved and do it, is one reason that we can all be optimistic. I mean, I agree with David that, that we all look to a younger generation, in a sense, to pull us out of this, and I don't say that as a way of, putting a burden on people's shoulders, but only that there is great possibility in the ability of younger people and others to lift us out of where we are at this moment. It's not going to happen overnight, but to approach it with a sense of what could be done if people pitch in.
I've been demoralized as I've watched on both the state and the national level the sort of systematic dismantling of important structural supports to our democracy under Scott Walker and under President Trump. But I really have a great sense of optimism right now, because I see, as I said, this slate of candidates, a candidate for governor who will know where the bodies are buried and know how to begin to build it back, and a team of people, and a lieutenant governor coming out of the city of Milwaukee, and our first African-American running for this position. We have an attorney general candidate who is brilliant, who I think will gain quickly national stature and provide leadership, and we won't have one who's suing against the ACA, but actually asking and leading support for it. And a state treasurer who has a plan to address the student loan issue. So what I see is a resilience built into our democracy precisely because we have a habit of being engaged that comes from good public education, and they haven't taken it out yet.
I'll just say that I think the short term is iffy, but if we get through that, there's a great future ahead. Thank you very much, everybody.